On News E2 now, it's happy 30th birthday, Horizon.
We have ignition sequence start.
She said, "What is his story?" And he said, "His story is an angel being blown backwards into the future." He said his story is a pile of debris, and the angel wants to go back.
An evening at Father Brown's vicarage. The Swedish retrospective. A dialogue in 8 chapters. Foreword by G.K. Chesterton. My dear reader, there is something particularly satisfying about an evening spent in good company, discussing the great questions of our time over proper English tea and biscuits. Tonight finds us in Father Brown's vicarage, where the good father has just returned from his extraordinary sojourn in Stockholm at Emanuel Swedenborg's residence during the Bilderberg gathering of 2025. What follows is Father Brown's recounting of that remarkable Swedish fika to myself and Hilaire Belloc, followed by the unexpected arrival of Roger Lewis and Ranjan, accompanied by their friends John Ward of The Slog and David Malone of Hyperland. The conversation that ensued proved to be one of the most illuminating discussions of our modern predicament that I have had the pleasure to witness. As the evening progressed, we found ourselves weaving together the threads of digital serfdom, financial manipulation, and the systematic erasure of human memory into a tapestry that revealed the true nature of our contemporary condition. The circle of blame that had emerged from our Stockholm discussions proved to be not merely a European phenomenon, but a global pattern of manufactured opposition serving identical masters. Chapter 1. Father Brown's Return. The Stockholm Recollection. The November evening was crisp as autumn leaves, when Father Brown returned to his vicarage, his face bearing the thoughtful expression of a man who had witnessed something extraordinary. Belloc and I had been waiting by the fire, eager to hear of his adventures in Sweden during the Bilderberg conference. "My dear Brown," I began, pouring him a cup of tea with the reverence due to a returning traveller, "you look as though you've been conversing with angels and demons in equal measure." Father Brown settled into his familiar chair with a gentle sigh. "Not far from the truth, Gilbert, though I suspect some of our guests might have been both simultaneously." He accepted the tea gratefully. Emanuel Swedenborg's Stockholm residence proved to be a most unusual venue for afternoon fika. Belloc, ever the pragmatist, leaned forward with interest. "And what did you discover in the shadow of this year's Bilderberg gathering? Any revelations about the puppet masters?" "Something far more disturbing," Father Brown replied, his voice taking on the tone he reserved for the most serious confessions. "We discovered that the puppet masters might themselves be puppets, dancing to music they don't understand, serving systems that have evolved beyond human control." I found myself leaning forward, intrigued. "You're speaking of the conversation with Carl Bildt and Otto Wallenberg, the 2 Bilderberg attendees who joined your philosophical gathering?" "Indeed. Picture, if you will, 2 men attending a conference dedicated to global coordination while simultaneously critiquing the very coordination they were participating in. The irony was not lost on any of us." Father Brown stirred his tea thoughtfully. "But what emerged was something more profound than simple hypocrisy." "Which was?" Belloc prompted. "The realization that what we call conspiracy might actually be something closer to unconscious convergence. That the financial system, the technology platforms, the political structures they've evolved to serve similar functions regardless of who operates them. You don't need secret coordination when the incentive structures produce identical outcomes." I felt a familiar thrill of recognition, the sensation of a paradox revealing deeper truth. So the conspiracy isn't conscious coordination, but unconscious coordination. The participants are as trapped by the system as everyone else? Precisely. And this connects to something our friend Fitzy observed about the European debt crisis, the circular nature of denial that revealed coordinated action disguised as separate national failures. Father Brown's eyes took on the distant look of a man recalling profound conversations. We identified a modern version of that same pattern. Belloc raised an eyebrow. Which is? The Americans blame the Israelis blame the Iranians blame the British blame historical circumstances, but they're all promoting the same diabolical plan: cultural extinction and global hybridity. The room fell silent except for the crackling of the fire and the gentle ticking of the mantel clock. The genius of the system, Father Brown continued, lies in its perfect symmetry. Each party maintains plausible deniability by genuinely believing in their assigned role while serving identical masters. The circular blame creates the illusion of opposition while ensuring coordination, the appearance of conflict while guaranteeing control. I set down my teacup with a clink that seemed unnaturally loud. And what of the spiritual dimension? I assume Emanuel Swedenborg had something to say about this. Father Brown's expression grew more serious. Swedenborg revealed perhaps the most disturbing truth of all. In the spiritual realm, he witnessed how earthly institutions that begin with good intentions can become vehicles for spiritual forces that oppose human flourishing. The participants may believe they're serving noble purposes, while actually serving their opposite. Belloc, ever the Catholic, nodded grimly. The road to hell being paved with good intentions, as it were. More than that, Father Brown replied. Swedenborg suggested that when human institutions serve themselves rather than human flourishing, they create openings for spiritual forces that feed on human suffering. Political corruption and spiritual corruption become aspects of the same phenomenon. As if summoned by our discussion of deeper mysteries, there came a knock at the vicarage door. Chapter 2. The Unexpected Arrivals. Roger and Ranjan bring reinforcements. The knock at the door proved to herald the arrival of Roger Lewis, his characteristic energy barely contained as he entered with his friend Ranjan in tow. But they were not alone. Behind them came two figures I recognized from reputation: John Ward, the acerbic voice behind The Slog, and David Malone, the filmmaker whose Hyperland podcast had become essential listening for those seeking truth in an age of manufactured reality. "Father Brown!" Roger exclaimed, his eyes bright with the enthusiasm of a man who had been following our Stockholm discussions with keen interest. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but when Ranjan and I heard you were back from Sweden, we simply had to come round, and when we mentioned it to John and David—" "The more the merrier," Father Brown replied with his characteristic warmth, already moving to prepare additional tea, "though I suspect this won't be a casual social call." John Ward, a man whose weathered face spoke of years spent observing human folly with sardonic precision, settled into a chair with the air of someone preparing for battle. "Roger's been telling us about your Stockholm conversations, Father. This business about the circle of blame, it connects to something I've been tracking for years." David Malone, his filmmaker's eye already assessing the dynamics of the room, nodded in agreement. "The patterns Roger described from your Swedish Fikathe are identical to what we've been documenting in the financial and political spheres. The systematic erasure of memory, the manufacture of perpetual opposition, the illusion of choice masking identical outcomes. I found myself pouring tea with the mechanical precision of a man whose mind was racing. You're suggesting that what we discovered in Stockholm has broader applications?" "I'm suggesting," John Ward replied with characteristic bluntness, "that what you discovered in Stockholm is the operating manual for the entire bloody system. The circle of blame isn't just about European debt or Middle Eastern conflicts, it's the fundamental structure of modern power." Ranjan, who had been listening with the intensity of a man processing complex algorithms, leaned forward. "The question is whether this represents conscious design or emergent behavior. Are we looking at a conspiracy or an evolutionary process?" "Both," Belloc interjected, with the confidence of a man who had spent decades analyzing power structures. "The beauty of the system is that it doesn't require conscious coordination at the top level. The incentive structures ensure that everyone plays their assigned role, while believing they're acting independently. Roger, unable to contain his excitement, began pacing the room. But this connects to everything we've been discussing. The digital serfdom, the financial manipulation, the systematic erasure of inconvenient archive exits, all part of the same pattern. Father Brown, having distributed tea to all present, settled back into his chair. Perhaps you could elaborate on these connections. I suspect our Stockholm insights might benefit from your additional perspectives. David Malone, his documentary maker's instincts engaged, leaned forward. Let me start with the memory erasure aspect. In my work on Hyperland, we've been tracking the systematic disappearance of digital archives. Blog posts about the European debt crisis, independent financial analysis, alternative historical narratives, they're vanishing at an unprecedented rate. Not just vanishing, John Ward added grimly, being actively scrubbed. The Let Them Confect Sweeterly's blog that Roger mentioned gone. My own early posts about the financial crisis, many of them mysteriously corrupted or deleted. It's not random link rot, it's systematic memory management. I felt the familiar chill of recognition. So the circle of blame serves not just to maintain the illusion of opposition, but to cover the systematic erasure of evidence that might reveal the coordination. Exactly, Roger replied, his voice taking on the intensity of a man who had spent years connecting dots. While everyone's distracted by the latest manufactured crisis, Brexit, Trump, COVID, Ukraine, Iran, Israel, the real infrastructure of control solidifies behind the scenes. Digital archives disappear, financial systems consolidate, surveillance apparatus expands. Ranjan, his technical background evident in his precise phrasing, added, "The genius is in the timing. Each crisis provides cover for another layer of control, another restriction on freedom, another consolidation of power. And because each crisis appears to be separate, people don't recognize the pattern." Father Brown stirred his tea with the slow deliberation of a man thinking through complex theological problems. What you're describing sounds remarkably similar to what Swedenborg revealed about spiritual forces operating through human institutions. The participants believe they're serving noble purposes while actually serving their opposite. Which brings us to the heart of the matter, John Ward said with characteristic directness. The question isn't whether there's a conspiracy, the question is whether anyone's actually in control of it. Chapter 3. The Hyperland Connection. David Malone on the architecture of digital control. David Malone set down his teacup with the precision of a man accustomed to handling delicate equipment, his filmmaker's eye studying each face in the room as if framing a shot. "The conversation you've been having," he began, "reminds me of something that happened during the making of my film The Farside back in 1994. I was exploring how technology shapes society, and I interviewed this Scottish physicist, Professor Sheila Gould. She said something that's haunted me ever since." Father Brown leaned forward with interest. "Which was?" "She said that as long as we control technology, we'll be fine. The question she posed was whether we would maintain that control or whether technology would end up controlling us." David's expression grew grim. 30 years later, I think we have our answer. Roger, unable to contain his enthusiasm, interjected, "But that's exactly what we've been discussing. The digital serfdom, the algorithmic control, the systematic erasure of memory, it's all part of the same pattern of technological control disguised as convenience." "More than that," David continued. "In that same film, I included a quote from Tony Benn that's become famous. What power have you got? Where did you get it from? In whose interests do you exercise it? To whom are you accountable? And how can we get rid of you?" Those questions are more relevant now than ever. John Ward, his blogger's instincts sharpening, leaned forward. Because the people with real power now are the ones who control the digital infrastructure. They're not elected, they're not accountable, and they're certainly not interested in being gotten rid of. Belloc, ever the Catholic intellectual, observed, "What you're describing sounds remarkably like the old problem of temporal versus spiritual authority, except now the spiritual authority is technological rather than religious." Exactly, David agreed. And just as the medieval church claimed to be serving God while accumulating earthly power, the tech giants claimed to be serving humanity while accumulating unprecedented control over human behavior. I found myself thinking of the paradoxes that had always fascinated me. So we have a situation where the tools meant to liberate human knowledge have become instruments of human control, where the internet, designed to democratize information, has become a mechanism for manufacturing consent. Ranjan, his technical background evident, added, "The algorithms that determine what information people see effectively shape their reality. It's not censorship in the traditional sense, it's something more subtle and more powerful. It's the curation of consciousness." Father Brown, his pastoral experience evident in his careful phrasing, observed, "What you're describing sounds like a form of spiritual warfare conducted through technological means. The battle for human souls fought through the manipulation of human attention." "Which connects directly to our Stockholm discussions," Roger added excitedly. "The circle of blame serves to distract attention while the real infrastructure of control solidifies. People argue about whether to blame America or Israel or Iran, while the same digital systems monitor and manipulate all of them." David nodded grimly. "And the beauty of the system is that it's self-reinforcing. The more people rely on digital platforms for information, the more control those platforms have over what people believe. The more people believe the manufactured narratives, the less likely they are to question the system that produces them." John Ward, with characteristic bluntness, cut to the heart of the matter. "So we're not just dealing with political or economic control, we're dealing with the systematic manipulation of human consciousness on a global scale. And the most disturbing part," David continued, "is that most of the people operating the system don't understand what they're doing. They genuinely believe they're making the world better, more connected, more informed. They don't recognize that they're participating in the largest experiment in human behavioral modification in history." Belloc, his historian's perspective evident, observed, "It reminds me of the old saying that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Except in this case, the road is paved with fiber optic cables and the hell is digital." Father Brown, ever the gentle voice of moral clarity, added, "Perhaps the most tragic aspect is that the technology itself isn't evil. It's the use to which it's been put, the purposes it's been made to serve. The same tools that could liberate human knowledge have been weaponized to control human behavior." Which brings us back to Professor Gould's question, David concluded. Do we control the technology, or does it control us? And if the answer is the latter, what do we do about it? The room fell silent as we contemplated the implications of this technological predicament, the fire crackling softly in the background, like the sound of synapses firing in a vast digital brain. Chapter 4. The Slog Perspective. John Ward, on the financial architecture of control. John Ward shifted in his chair with the restless energy of a man who had spent years documenting the systematic looting of democratic institutions. His weathered face bore the expression of someone who had seen too much and understood too well the patterns others preferred to ignore. "The digital control David's describing," he began, "is just one layer of a much more comprehensive system. The real power lies in the financial architecture that underpins everything else. And that's where the circle of blame becomes truly diabolical." Father Brown, recognizing the gravity in John's tone, leaned forward attentively. "How so?" "Consider the European debt crisis that Fitzy originally identified." John replied, his voice taking on the precision of a man who had tracked every detail. "Spain is not Greece. Portugal is not Greece. Ireland is not Greek territorial country desperately distancing itself from the others, while all implementing identical austerity measures dictated by the same financial institutions." Roger, his excitement evident, added, "And the modern version Americans blame Israelis, Israelis blame Iranians, Iranians blame British, but they're all serving the same financial masters." "Precisely," John continued. "The genius of the system is that it creates the illusion of national sovereignty while ensuring that all nations serve the same creditor class. Whether you're in Athens or Dublin or Madrid, you end up implementing the same policies, serving the same interests, enriching the same people. Belloc, his Catholic social teaching evident, observed, "What you're describing sounds like usury on a global scale, the systematic extraction of wealth from productive communities to serve financial parasites." "That's exactly what it is," John agreed. "But it's usury disguised as national policy, extraction disguised as economic necessity, theft disguised as fiscal responsibility." David Malone, his filmmaker's instincts engaged, leaned forward. "And the media plays a crucial role in maintaining the illusion. They focus on the surface, conflicts Greek profligacy versus German prudence, American interests versus Iranian resistance, while ignoring the underlying financial structures that benefit from all sides of every conflict." Ranjan, his analytical mind processing the implications, added, "So the circle of blame serves multiple functions simultaneously. It distracts from the real power structures, it provides justification for unpopular policies, and it prevents coordination between groups that should be natural allies." "Exactly," John replied. "The Greek people and the German people both suffer from austerity, but they're taught to blame each other rather than the banks that profit from both their suffering. The American people and the Iranian people both suffer from militarism, but they're taught to fear each other rather than the arms dealers who profit from their mutual hostility." I found myself thinking of the paradoxes that had always fascinated me. So we have a situation where the victims of the system are turned against each other while the beneficiaries remain invisible. "Not invisible," John corrected, "hidden in plain sight. BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, they own controlling stakes in virtually every major corporation, every major bank, every major media company. They're the real government, the real power, the real authority. But they operate through proxies, through front organizations, through the illusion of competition and democracy." Father Brown, his pastoral experience evident in his understanding of human nature, observed, "What you're describing sounds like a form of spiritual possession human institutions serving purposes that oppose human flourishing while maintaining the appearance of serving human needs." "That's not a bad analogy," John agreed. "The institutions claim to serve the public interest while actually serving private profit. The politicians claim to represent the people while actually representing the donors. The media claims to inform the public while actually manufacturing consent." Roger, pacing the room with characteristic energy, added, "And the digital platforms David mentioned provide the perfect mechanism for maintaining this illusion. They can amplify certain voices while suppressing others, promote certain narratives while burying others, create the appearance of grassroots movements while actually orchestrating AstroTurf campaigns." "Which brings us to the most disturbing aspect of the whole system," John continued. "It's not just that the people at the top are evil, though many of them are. It's that the system has evolved to serve its own perpetuation regardless of human intentions. Even well-meaning people get caught up in it, become part of it, serve it without understanding what they're doing." Belloc, his historian's perspective evident, observed, "It reminds me of Hilaire Belloc's analysis of the servile starter system, where people believe they're free while actually being systematically enslaved." "Exactly," John replied. "We have the illusion of choice Republican or Democrat, Conservative or Labour, leave or remain, but all the choices lead to the same outcomes. We have the illusion of information, thousands of news sources, millions of websites, billions of social media posts, but all the information is filtered through the same algorithms, shaped by the same incentives, serving the same purposes." Father Brown, ever the gentle voice of moral clarity, asked the crucial question, "So what do we do about it? How do we break free from a system that has evolved to prevent its own exposure?" John Ward smiled grimly. "That, Father, is the question that's been keeping me awake at night for the better part of 2 decades. Chapter 5. The Digital Archaeology. Roger Lewis on the systematic erasure of memory. Roger Lewis, who had been pacing the room with barely contained energy, suddenly stopped and turned to face us with the intensity of a man who had discovered something profound and disturbing. The conversation we're having right now, he began, is exactly the kind of conversation that's being systematically erased from the digital record. Not through dramatic book burnings or obvious censorship, but through the quiet, persistent deletion of inconvenient archives. Father Brown, recognizing the gravity in Roger's tone, set down his teacup. You're referring to the disappearance of the blog posts John mentioned? Much more than that, Roger replied, his voice taking on the urgency of a man racing against time. I've been documenting the systematic erasure of financial and political analysis from the internet. The Let Them Confect Sweeterly's blog that analysed the European debt crisis completely gone. David Malone's People's Debt Jubilee analysis vanished. Fitz's observations about the circular nature of European denial erased. David Malone, his filmmaker's instincts alert to the implications, leaned forward. It's not just random link rod, is it? There's a pattern to what disappears and what remains. Exactly, Roger confirmed. The content that disappears tends to be the content that reveals the coordinated nature of what appears to be separate phenomena. Analysis that connects the dots, that shows the patterns, that reveals the puppet strings, that's what gets memory hold. John Ward, his blogger's experience evident, nodded grimly. I've seen it happen to my own work. Posts that were getting significant traffic, that were being shared widely, that were making connections people weren't supposed to make. Suddenly they develop technical problems, or get flagged for policy violations, or simply disappear. Ranjan, his technical background, allowing him to understand the mechanisms involved, added, "The beauty of digital erasure is its plausible deniability. Server crashes, policy updates, platform changes there are always technical explanations for why content disappears. No one has to admit to deliberate censorship." I found myself thinking of the libraries of Alexandria and the countless manuscripts lost to fire and flood throughout history. But surely this is nothing new. Haven't inconvenient truths always been suppressed? The scale is unprecedented, Roger replied with conviction. In the past, you had to physically destroy books, manuscripts, documents. It was expensive, obvious, risky. Now you can erase vast archives with the click of a button, and most people won't even notice. Belloc, his Catholic intellectual background evident, observed, "What you're describing sounds like a form of technological iconoclasm, systematic destruction of the intellectual and cultural record." But it's worse than that, Roger continued, his excitement building, because the erasure is selective. They don't destroy everything, they preserve the content that serves their purposes, while eliminating the content that challenges their narratives. Future historians will have a completely distorted view of our era, because the inconvenient evidence will simply be gone. Father Brown, his pastoral experience, evident in his understanding of the spiritual dimensions of truth, observed, "What you're describing sounds like a form of spiritual warfare, the battle for human memory, for the right to define reality itself." That's exactly what it is, David Malone agreed, and it connects directly to the technological control we were discussing earlier. The same platforms that shape what people see in the present also control what evidence remains of the past. Roger, unable to contain his enthusiasm for the connections he was making, began pacing again, and this is where the circle of blame becomes truly insidious. While people are distracted by the latest manufactured controversy, Brexit, Trump, COVID, Ukraine, the real work of memory management continues in the background. The perfect crime, John Ward observed, with characteristic bluntness. Not only do they steal the present, they steal the past as well. Future generations won't even know what was stolen from them because the evidence of the theft will have been erased. Ranjan, his analytical mind processing the implications, added, "And the process is accelerating. As more human knowledge becomes digitized, more of it becomes vulnerable to this kind of selective erasure. We're creating a civilization with no permanent memory." Which is why, Roger continued with growing intensity, the work we're doing here, the conversations we're having, the connections we're making, they're acts of resistance. Every time we remember what they want us to forget, Every time we connect dots, they want to keep separate. Every time we preserve knowledge, they want to erase. We're fighting back. Father Brown, ever the gentle voice of hope in darkness, smiled slightly. So our little gathering here tonight is itself a form of digital archaeology, an attempt to preserve and connect truths that are being systematically buried? Exactly, Roger replied, his eyes bright with the satisfaction of a man who had found the perfect metaphor. We're digital archaeologists, excavating the buried truths of our own era, preserving the memory of what really happened before it disappears forever. The room fell silent as we contemplated this sobering responsibility, the weight of being witnesses to the systematic erasure of human memory in real time. Chapter 6. The Circle Completed. Connecting Stockholm to the Slog. As the evening deepened and the fire settled into glowing embers, the conversation took on a more reflective tone. The various threads we had been following, the Stockholm fika, the digital erasure, the financial architecture, the technological control, began to weave together into a coherent pattern. Father Brown, ever the patient shepherd of wayward thoughts, posed the question that had been hovering over our entire discussion. So, what have we learned? How do the insights from Stockholm connect to the observations from the Slog and Hyperland? John Ward, his weathered face thoughtful in the firelight, spoke first. What we've learned is that the circle of blame isn't just a European phenomenon or a Middle Eastern phenomenon, it's the fundamental operating principle of modern power. Every level of the system, from local politics to global finance, operates on the same principle. Create the illusion of opposition while ensuring identical outcomes. David Malone, his filmmaker's eye seeing the broader picture, added, and the technological infrastructure provides the perfect mechanism for maintaining this illusion. The same algorithms that shape what people see, the same platforms that control information flow, the same systems that erase inconvenient memories, they all serve to perpetuate the circle of blame. Roger, his energy now focused and purposeful, leaned forward. But here's what I find most significant about our Stockholm discussions, the recognition that even the supposed puppet masters might be puppets themselves. The people at Bilderberg, the politicians, the CEOs, they might be as trapped by the system as everyone else. Ranjan, his analytical mind processing the implications, observed, which suggests that we're not dealing with a traditional conspiracy in the sense of a small group of people consciously coordinating to control the world. We're dealing with something more like an emergent system that has evolved to serve its own perpetuation. Belloc, his Catholic social teaching evident, added, what you're describing sounds remarkably like what the Church has always taught about the nature of evil, that it's not just individual wickedness, but systematic disorder, the corruption of good institutions to serve purposes that oppose human flourishing. I found myself thinking of the paradoxes that had always fascinated me. So we have a system that operates through the appearance of its opposite control, through the illusion of freedom, coordination through the appearance of conflict, uniformity through the illusion of choice. Father Brown, his theological training evident, observed, what you're describing sounds like the perfect inversion of divine ordera system that takes every good thing and turns it to serve evil purposes while maintaining the appearance of serving good ones. And the most disturbing aspect, John Ward added with characteristic bluntness, is that most of the people operating the system genuinely believe they're doing good. They're not mustache-twirling villains, they're true believers in their own righteousness. David Malone nodded grimly, which makes resistance much more difficult. You can't simply expose the bad guys because the bad guys don't think they're bad guys. You can't reveal the conspiracy because the conspirators don't know they're conspirators. Roger, his excitement building again, stood and began pacing. But that's exactly why our conversation tonight is so important. We're not just identifying the problem, we're modeling the solution. We're demonstrating how people can come together across different backgrounds and perspectives to see through the illusions and connect the dots. The solution, Father Brown observed gently, seems to lie not in grand political movements or technological fixes, but in small gatherings like this, one people committed to truth, willing to think for themselves, determined to preserve memory, and maintain sanity in an increasingly insane world. Ranjan, his technical background evident, added, and the beauty of this approach is that it's anti-fragile. The more they try to suppress it, the stronger it becomes. The more they try to control information, the more valuable independent thinking becomes. The more they try to erase memory, the more important preservation becomes. John Ward, with a rare smile, observed, so perhaps the real victory isn't in defeating the system, perhaps it's in refusing to be defeated by it. In maintaining our humanity, our sanity, our ability to think and remember and connect, regardless of what they throw at us. And in that sense, David Malone concluded, every conversation like this one is a victory. Every connection made, every truth preserved, every illusion pierced, it's all part of a larger resistance that operates not through political power, but through the simple refusal to be fooled. Father Brown, ever the gentle voice of hope, smiled as he looked around the room at our unlikely assembly. Then perhaps what we've accomplished tonight is more significant than we realize. We've taken the insights from Stockholm, connected them to the observations from years of independent research, and created something newer, clearer understanding of our situation and our possibilities. As the evening drew to a close, we sat in comfortable silence, each lost in our own thoughts about the patterns we had uncovered and the responsibilities they implied. Outside, the world continued its ancient dance of truth and deception, but inside Father Brown's vicarage, we had created a small space of clarity in an increasingly confused world. Chapter 7. Professor Gould's question revisited. Technology, control, and human agency. As our evening drew toward its natural conclusion, David Malone suddenly looked up from his contemplation of the dying fire with the expression of a man who had just remembered something crucial. There's one more connection I want to make, he said, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years' reflection. Roger mentioned Professor Sheila Gould from my 1994 film The Farside. She posed a question that, I think, cuts to the heart of everything we've been discussing tonight. Father Brown, recognizing the gravity in David's tone, leaned forward attentively. Which was? She said that as long as we control technology, we'll be fine. The question was whether we would maintain that control or whether technology would end up controlling us. David's expression grew somber. 30 years later, looking at everything we've discussed, the digital serfdom, the algorithmic manipulation, the systematic erasure of memory, I think, we have our answer. John Ward, with characteristic bluntness, cut straight to the implications. We've lost control. The technology is controlling us. The question now is whether we can get it back. Roger, his energy focused and intense, began pacing again. But that's exactly what makes our conversation tonight so significant. We're demonstrating that human agency still exists, that people can still think independently, that consciousness can still pierce through the manufactured reality. Ranjan, his technical background evident, observed, the key insight is that technology itself isn't the problem. It's the use to which technology has been put. The same digital systems that enable surveillance and control could theoretically enable liberation and empowerment. But that's the crucial point, David continued. Professor Gould assumed that we would be making the choice about how to use technology. What we've discovered is that the choice has been made for us by systems and incentives that operate beyond democratic control. Belloc, his Catholic intellectual background evident, added, what you're describing sounds like the old theological problem of free will versus determinism, except now played out through technological rather than metaphysical means. I found myself thinking of the paradoxes that had always fascinated me. So we have a situation where the tools meant to enhance human freedom have become instruments of human bondage, where the technology designed to serve human needs has evolved to make humans serve its needs. Father Brown, his theological training evident, observed, what you're describing sounds remarkably like the classical definition of idolatry, the worship of created things rather than the creator, the service of tools rather than purposes. And the most insidious aspect, Roger added with growing intensity, is that the bondage is voluntary. People choose to carry surveillance devices, choose to surrender their privacy, choose to consume algorithmic contental while believing they're exercising freedom of choice. John Ward nodded grimly. It's the perfect form of control, the kind that doesn't feel like control at all. People defend their own enslavement because they've been convinced it's liberation. David Malone, his filmmaker's instincts engaged, leaned forward. Which brings us back to the circle of blame. The same pattern that operates in politics and finance operates in technology, create the illusion of choice while ensuring identical outcomes. Android or iPhone, Facebook or Twitter, Google or Bing, different brands, serving the same masters. But here's what gives me hope, Father Brown said, his gentle voice cutting through the gathering gloom. The fact that we can have this conversation, the fact that we can see through the illusions, the fact that we can choose to think for ourselves, that suggests that human agency isn't entirely dead. Ranjan, his analytical mind processing the implications, added, and the beauty of consciousness is that it's contagious. Every person who wakes up, who starts thinking independently, who refuses to be controlled, they become a seed of awakening for others. Roger, his excitement building again, stopped pacing and faced the group. That's exactly why the systematic erasure of memory is so crucial to their system. They have to constantly erase the evidence of human agency, human resistance, human independence, because if people remembered that they once thought for themselves, they might start doing it again. Which makes our role as digital archaeologists even more important, David observed. We're not just preserving information, we're preserving the memory of human agency itself, the evidence that people once thought independently and could do so again. John Ward, his blogger's instincts sharpening, leaned forward. And that's why they're so desperate to control the narrative about technology. They can't admit that the current system was a choice, because if it was a choice, it can be unchosen. They have to present it as inevitable, as natural evolution, as the only possible path. But Professor Gould's question reveals the lie, David continued. She assumed we had a choice because we did have a choice. The technology could have developed differently, could have served different purposes, could have enhanced rather than diminished human agency. I found myself thinking of the roads not taken, the possibilities foreclosed. So what you're suggesting is that the current technological dystopia isn't the inevitable result of technological progress, but the result of specific choices made by specific people serving specific interests. Exactly, Roger replied with conviction. And if it was chosen, it can be unchosen. If it was designed, it can be redesigned. If it serves certain interests, it can be made to serve different interests. Father Brown, ever the gentle voice of hope, smiled slightly. Which brings us back to the fundamental question of human responsibility. We may not be able to control the system as it currently exists, but we can control our response to it. Belloc, his Catholic social teaching evident, added, and our response begins with understanding, seeing the system clearly, recognizing its purposes, refusing to be deceived by its claims about itself. Ranjan, his technical background evident, observed, the irony is that the same technology they use to control us could be used to liberate us. Decentralized networks, encrypted communications, distributed storage, the tools, exist to create alternatives. But the real liberation, David continued, isn't technological, it's psychological. It's the recognition that we have choices, that we have agency, that we don't have to accept the reality that's been manufactured for us. John Ward, with a rare note of optimism, added, and that's what conversations like this one accomplish. They demonstrate that independent thought is still possible, that human connection can still transcend algorithmic manipulation, that consciousness can still pierce through manufactured confusion. Roger, his energy now focused and purposeful, concluded, so perhaps the answer to Professor Gould's question isn't whether we control technology or it controls us. Perhaps the answer is that the battle for control is ongoing, and every moment of consciousness, every act of independent thought, every refusal to be manipulated is a victory in that battle. Father Brown, looking around at our unlikely assembly, observed, then perhaps what we've accomplished tonight is more significant than we realize. We've demonstrated that human agency still exists, that independent thought is still possible, that the circle of blame can be broken by people willing to think for themselves. Chapter 8. The Hyperland Synthesis. John Ward answers the call. As our evening reached its natural conclusion, John Ward suddenly straightened in his chair with the expression of a man who had just seen all the pieces of a complex puzzle fall into place. "You know," he said, his voice carrying a note of discovery, "listening to all of this, the Stockholm insights, the digital archaeology, the technological control, Professor Gould's question, I'm beginning to see a synthesis that I hadn't quite grasped before." David Malone, recognizing the tone of a fellow truth seeker on the verge of breakthrough, leaned forward with interest. "Which is?" "The circle of blame isn't just a political phenomenon, or an economic phenomenon, or a technological phenomenon," John replied, his weathered face animated with the excitement of understanding. "It's the fundamental structure of modern consciousness itself." Father Brown, his theological training alert to the spiritual dimensions, observed, "You're suggesting that the pattern operates not just in external systems, but in how people think about those systems." "Exactly," John confirmed. "Think about it. People blame the politicians blame the bureaucrats blame the system blames human nature blames evolution blames randomness. It circles of blame all the way down." Roger, his excitement building, began pacing again, and each level of blame serves to obscure the level above it. People focus on the politicians while ignoring the donors, focus on the donors while ignoring the systems, focus on the systems while ignoring the designers. Ranjan, his analytical mind processing the implications, added, "So the circle of blame operates as a kind of cognitive firewall, preventing people from tracing problems back to their actual sources. And the digital systems David described provide the perfect mechanism for maintaining this cognitive firewall." John continued, "The algorithms ensure that people see only the level of blame they're comfortable with, never the deeper patterns that might lead to uncomfortable conclusions." Belloc, his historian's perspective evident, observed, "What you're describing sounds like a technological version of what the Church has always called the mystery of iniquity, the systematic obscuring of truth to serve the purposes of evil." I found myself thinking of the Hall of Mirrors, each reflection distorting the image while claiming to reveal truth. So we have a situation where every level of analysis leads to another level of misdirection. Every explanation serves to hide the need for deeper explanation, until you reach the level we've been operating at tonight, David observed. The level where you step outside the circle of blame entirely and ask not who to blame, but how the blaming system itself serves to perpetuate the problems it claims to address. Father Brown, his pastoral experience evident in his understanding of human nature, added, "Which requires a kind of intellectual and spiritual courage that most people find difficult to sustain. It's much easier to blame someone else than to examine the system that makes the blaming necessary." John Ward, his blogger's instincts engaged, leaned forward. "But here's what gives me hope. The fact that we can have this conversation, the fact that we can see through the various levels of misdirection, suggests that the system isn't perfect. There are still cracks in the matrix, still spaces for independent thought. And every conversation like this one," Roger added with growing conviction, "creates more cracks, more spaces, more possibilities for people to step outside the circle of blame and see the larger patterns." Ranjan, his technical background evident, observed, "The beauty of understanding the system is that once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you recognize the circle of blame, you start seeing it everywhere in politics, in media, in personal relationships, in your own thinking." "Which brings us to the practical question," David said, his filmmaker's instincts focused on outcomes. "What do we do with this understanding? How do we use it to create positive change?" John Ward smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "We do exactly what we've been doing tonight. We preserve memory, we make connections, we refuse to be fooled, we maintain our sanity in an insane world. And we trust that consciousness is contagious, that truth has its own power, that light naturally dispels darkness. And we remember, Father Brown added gently, that the battle for human consciousness is ultimately a spiritual battle, fought not with weapons or wealth, but with truth and love, and the simple refusal to surrender our humanity to systems that would make us less than human. As the fire died to embers and the evening drew to its close, we sat in comfortable silence, each processing the implications of what we had discovered together. Outside, the world continued its ancient dance of truth and deception, but inside Father Brown's vicarage we had created something pursues a space of clarity in an increasingly confused world, a moment of genuine human connection in an age of manufactured division. Epilogue: The Morning After. G. K. Chesterton's reflection. As I write these words in the grey light of dawn, with the others long departed and Father Brown finally retired to his well-deserved rest, I find myself thinking about the extraordinary evening we have just concluded. What began as a simple recounting of Father Brown's Swedish adventures evolved into something far more significant, a synthesis of insights that revealed the true nature of our contemporary predicament. The circle of blame that emerged from our Stockholm discussions proved to be not merely a European phenomenon or a Middle Eastern conflict, but the fundamental operating principle of modern power itself. Every level of our society, political, economic, technological, even psychological, operates on the same basic pattern: create the illusion of opposition while ensuring identical outcomes, manufacture conflict while serving unified interests, provide the appearance of choice while eliminating genuine alternatives. But perhaps most significantly, we discovered that this pattern operates not just in external systems, but in human consciousness itself. The same circular logic that keeps nations blaming each other while serving the same masters also keeps individuals trapped in cycles of misdirected anger and futile resistance. People blame the symptoms while ignoring the disease, attack the puppets while protecting the puppet masters, fight the shadows while leaving the substance untouched. Yet, our evening also demonstrated something profoundly hopeful, that human consciousness, when properly directed, can pierce through any amount of manufactured confusion. The fact that 6 men from different backgrounds and perspectives could come together and see through the illusions, connect the dots, and arrive at genuine understanding suggests that the human capacity for truth remains undiminished despite all attempts to suppress it. The digital archaeology that Roger described, the technological insights that David provided, the financial analysis that John offered, the spiritual dimensions that Father Brown revealed, all of these perspectives were necessary to see the complete picture. No single viewpoint, however brilliant, could have encompassed the full scope of our contemporary predicament. This suggests something important about the nature of resistance in our age. The old models of political opposition parties, movements, ideologies shave, all been captured by the circle of blame. They provide the illusion of choice while serving identical masters. Real resistance must operate at a different level entirely. The level of consciousness itself, the level of genuine human connection, the level of truth that transcends all manufactured divisions. The systematic erasure of digital memory that we discussed is not merely a technical problem, but a spiritual one. The battle for human consciousness is being fought in the realm of memory itself, the right to remember what really happened, to preserve inconvenient truths, to maintain the evidence of human agency and resistance. Every blog post deleted, every archive scrubbed, every inconvenient analysis disappeared represents a victory for the forces of manufactured amnesia. But every conversation, like the one we had last night, represents a victory for the forces of genuine memory. Every connection made, every pattern recognized, every illusion pierced, becomes part of a larger awakening that no amount of digital manipulation can entirely suppress. Professor Gould's question whether we control technology or it controls use revealed itself to be not a question about technology per se, but about human agency itself. The same forces that have captured our political systems and economic systems have also captured our technological systems, turning tools of liberation into instruments of control. But the capture is not complete, the control is not perfect, the system is not invulnerable. The cracks in the matrix that John Ward identified are real and growing. Every person who refuses to be fooled, every mind that thinks independently, every heart that maintains its humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization represents a crack in the system that can never be fully sealed. As I reflect on our evening's work, I am struck by how naturally our conversation moved from analysis to synthesis, from criticism to hope, from despair to determination. This suggests something important about the nature of truth itself, that it naturally tends toward wholeness, toward connection, toward the integration of apparently separate phenomena into coherent understanding. The circle of blame is ultimately a circle of lies, and lies require constant energy to maintain. Truth, by contrast, has its own momentum, its own power, its own tendency to emerge, despite all attempts at suppression. Our task is not to create truth, but to recognize it, not to manufacture hope, but to discover it, not to impose meaning, but to uncover it. The vicarage has returned to its customary quiet, but the ideas we explored continue to resonate. Somewhere in Stockholm, the Bilderberg Conference has concluded with its usual platitudes about global cooperation. Somewhere in cyberspace, inconvenient archives continue to disappear. Somewhere in the corridors of power, the circle of blame continues its ancient dance. But somewhere else in vicarages and coffee shops, in blogs and podcasts, in conversations between friends who refuse to be fooled, the real work of human liberation continues. Not through grand political gestures or technological solutions, but through the simple, persistent, courageous act of thinking for oneself and speaking the truth. And that perhaps is enough. In an age of universal deception, the simple act of seeing clearly becomes revolutionary. In a time of manufactured division, genuine human connection becomes an act of resistance. In an era of systematic forgetting, the preservation of memory becomes a sacred duty. The morning light grows stronger as I write these final words, and with it comes the promise of another day, another opportunity to choose truth over lies, connection over division, memory over amnesia. The circle of blame will continue its work, but so will we. And in that simple fact lies all the hope the world needs. G.K. Chesterton, Beaconsfield, November 2025. Appendix: The evolution of the circle. As our conversation demonstrated, the circle of blame has evolved from Fitzey's original observation about European debt denial into a comprehensive framework for understanding modern power. The pattern remains consistent across all levels. Original European Circle, 2000 and 10-2000 and 11. Spain is not Greece. Portugal is not Greece. Ireland is not in Greek territory. Greece is not Ireland. Each nation denying similarity while implementing identical policies. Global Geopolitical Circle, 2025. Americans blame Israelis. Israelis blame Iranians. Iranians blame British. British blame historical circumstances. All serving the same agenda of cultural extinction and global hybridity. Technological circle. Users blame platforms. Platforms blame algorithms. Algorithms blame data. Data blames users. All serving the same surveillance capitalism. Financial circle. Debtors blame creditors. Creditors blame markets. Markets blame regulations. Regulations blame politics. All serving the same extraction system. Consciousness circle. Individuals blame society. Society blames institutions. Institutions blame human nature. Human nature blames evolution. All preventing recognition of agency and choice. The genius of the system lies in its perfect recursive structure. Every level of blame serves to obscure the level above it. creating an infinite regress that prevents people from ever reaching the actual source of problems. But once the pattern is recognized, it becomes visible everywhere, and its power to deceive begins to diminish. Our evening's work suggests that the antidote to the circle of blame is not counter-blame, but the transcendence of blame itself, the recognition that the blaming system serves to perpetuate the problems it claims to address, and that real solutions lie in stepping outside the circle entirely. End of dialogue. A People's Debt Jubilee by Golem XIV. May 22, 2011. This wonderful image by Escher of two hands drawing each other is one of my favourite pieces of modern art. The most dangerous lies are those that contain just enough truth to be believable, and the most profitable truths are those that can be packaged as secrets and sold to people who think they're too smart to be fooled. Lucian of Samosata, as remembered in Father Brown's Vicarage, November 2025. For me, it is a brilliant visualization of the idea of bootstrapping, or to put it more loosely, how you get something from nothing. Evolution is an example. From something simple you can get something complex. From chemistry you bootstrap life. From life you evolve consciousness and self-awareness, and finally Beethoven and Proust. In evolution there is no need for an outside artist. Species, just like the hands, draw each other into existence. I have no idea if Escher meant this when he drew the hands, but his engraving captures it nevertheless. The reason I mention this piece of art is because if you are a particularly stupid species, you can reverse this process. All you need to do is replace the pencils with rubbers, and you have the perfect image of what we are currently doing in our crisis of collective indebtedness. So, for example, the Greeks, Spanish, Portuguese and Irish are all erasing themselves in an effort to pay off debt via austerity. Austerity which has so far failed to reduce the debts, but has erased the means by which they had hoped to pay the debts. In each of those countries, the economy has shrunk faster than the burden of debts, leaving them worse off than before, which is why each of them has suffered credit downgrades. David Malone. Thanks for listening.
The only thing we can be sure of about the future is that it will be absolutely fantastic.
Our generation thought you could do anything. There was a period, the end of the war, when all the science fiction programs were produced and people imagined everyone would go to work on an individual rocket and you'd have travelators and life would be totally dominated by technology. And in the event, of course, when it happens, people realize there's more to it than that. But of course the real interest in science has always been it gives humanity, allegedly, control over nature. Knowledge replaces superstition.
We have ignition sequence start. The engines are on. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Science is...
Anthony Wedgwood Benn is a keen and involved observer of this process of technological change. As Minister of Technology, he is concerned with bringing about such changes. Horizon invited him to present a program on the questions that interest him, arising out of the problems he has to deal with as Minister of Technology.
And the argument is a very simple one. It won't be unfamiliar to anybody. It is that technology is power, and that's the only way you can really look at it. It's power, and it's increasing very rapidly.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I always think of this century, the growth of power. Beginning of the century, train could travel 60 miles an hour, now spacecraft at 25,000 miles an hour. Largest audience you could address was through a megaphone, now you could address virtually the population of the world. The quickest number of calculations was with an abacus, now a computer can make millions of calculations in a microsecond. And then the largest number of people you could kill was with a Maxim machine gun, now you can kill hundreds of millions of people. And this has created power structures that in a sense have outdated all our institutions of control. And how you get control of these new power centers is the central political question of the century and of the next century.
And even more important for political purposes, of course, this is the expectation gap. It's one thing to be poor when everybody else is poor, It's another thing to be poor when you know that, of course, it is no longer necessary for people to be poor. And this is a major new political feature introduced by the development of technology.
When I was first invited to do that Horizon program in 1968, thinking about this and the growth of multinational companies and defense budgets and comparing them to the budgets of nation states, I also was hard at work thinking about how you could bring power closer to people so they could determine for themselves how it was used. And the more I've thought about that, the more relevant I think that analysis was.
When superstition made people petrify the heavens.
The pound is now floating free and falling fast on the foreign exchanges.
The way in which international capital now dictates to governments what they can do. The International Monetary Fund tells the government, if you don't cut your health and educational expenditure, we'll destroy the value of your currency. And if democracy is ever destroyed in Britain, it won't be some blood-stained revolutionary. It'll be because that power that we struggled very hard to acquire through the ballot box has been taken away from us, and we're spectators of our fate. And I don't think that will be acceptable. But at the moment, people may not be fully aware of what's happening.
In the 60s, we allowed technology to happen to us passively. We accepted the story that we were told.
Going up to meet the gods.
This is Apollo 8 coming to you live from the moon. I think that each one of us carries his own impressions of what he's seen today.
Well, I sat at home in the morning with my children, and I watched the landing on the moon, and then I looked out of the window and I could see the moon there. And the idea of scientific advance on that scale was absolutely breathtaking. I've never forgotten that when the Russians put a spacecraft on the moon, put a vehicle on the moon, somebody said to me in Bristol, if they can do that, why can't we have a decent bus service in Bristol? Now, it was a very powerful question, really, because it's quite obvious that the military demands were what really shaped the nature of technology. And so there was always at the heart, and always will be at the heart of scientific and technological questions, political and moral choices about how it's to be used.
The poor are caught in vicious circles.
Or can't you? You already see that now in the communities I work in, which are in universities. Those who have access to information and those who don't.
Knowledge is power. And science, particularly when applied in the technological field, creates power. I mean, you could use computers, for example, to keep a dossier of everybody who has dangerous ideas. Or you can have a computer that allows you to know which old age pensioner is likely to die of hypothermia. You can use all technology for different purposes. The question is, what is the purpose? And that is a political and not a scientific question.
And here's the system in action.
The step liner.
I mean, the view that Wilson took when he made his great speech about the white heat of technological revolution was very simple, never interpreted properly at the time. He said that scientific change will burn us up with unemployment unless we plan it. That's what he meant by the white heat. It wasn't that he was going to put on a white coat and go around with a blowtorch and improve the technical infrastructure. What he was warning us of, and he was absolutely right because we've seen it happen since, that if you don't plan technical change, then you're burned up by unemployment and all the after effects and side effects of technology.
There's a growing view that technology has already produced its finest achievements. In fact, Kahn sees the world of the future as something like that of Westchester County, where he has his home. Whether it's in the hills of Korea or the mudflats of the Amazon, man can create this world for everyone.
Oh, I think the priesthood of technology, sort of at one end almost technological fascism. If you don't understand what I understand, you're not even entitled to ask any question.
This is what technology was going to do for us, and we just blindly accepted it and followed it. We must make sure that we control technology, not that technology controls us, and it's up to us to make sure that doesn't happen.
You probably know my 5 democratic questions. If you meet a powerful person, it might have been Hitler or Stalin or Robert Maxwell or Jacques Delors. You ask them 5 questions. What power have you got? Where did you get it from? in whose interest you exercise it, to whom you're accountable, and how can we get rid of you? Now that democratic question, how can we get rid of you, is the only way you can get any control over the people who govern you. And that applies if the power they have over you is scientific, political, economic, industrial, or...
She said, what is his story? And he said, his story is an angel being blown backwards into the future. He said his story is a pile of debris, and the angel wants to go back and fix things, to repair the things that have been broken. But there's a storm blowing from paradise, and the storm keeps blowing the angel backwards into the future. And this storm